He had seen men burn inside tanks. He had walked battlefields where the dead lay so thick you could cross a field without stepping on grass. He had ordered charges into machine gun fire, watched artillery reduce whole towns to powder, and never once flinched. George S. Patton, old blood and guts, was not a man given to weakness. He had spent his entire adult life cultivating a personality built for war, for the worst that human beings could do to one another on a battlefield. And then on the morning of April 12, 1945, he walked through the gates of a place called Ohrdruf, and he had to stop. And he turned away from a shed full of bodies, and he vomited against the side of a building. Whatever he had thought he knew about the worst of human nature, he had been wrong. If this is your first time here, welcome. This channel exists to tell the real stories, the ones that don't fit neatly into the myths we build around wars and the men who fight them. If that's what you're looking for, subscribe now and turn on the notifications. These stories need to be remembered, and they need to be told right. To understand what Patton found at Ohrdruf, you have to understand what he was in April of 1945. He was the most aggressive battlefield commander in the United States Army, possibly in the entire Allied coalition. His Third Army had torn across France after the breakout from Normandy in the summer of 1944, covering ground so fast that his supply lines couldn't keep up. He had driven his men through the snow and the bitter cold of the Ardennes to relieve Bastogne during the Battle of the Bulge. By the early spring of 1945, his tanks were punching deep into the heart of Germany, and no one was surprised. This was what Patton did. In late March 1945, Third Army crossed the Rhine River. The German resistance was collapsing in places, chaotic, desperate, sometimes ferocious in pockets, but fundamentally broken as an organized force. Patton's armored columns were moving so fast that they were often outrunning intelligence about what lay ahead. The war, everyone sensed, was entering its final chapter. The question was not whether Germany would fall. The question was how much blood it would cost to finish it. In the first days of April, units of the 4th Armored Division and the 89th Infantry Division, both part of Patton's Third Army, were pushing southeast through the German state of Thuringia, near a town called Gotha. The intelligence they had was fragmentary. There were reports of some kind of German installation in the area, possibly connected to communications infrastructure. The landscape was green and unremarkable, the kind of rolling German countryside that had been producing soldiers and farmers for centuries. Nothing about it suggested what was coming. On April 4, 1945, those soldiers approached a perimeter fence outside a small German town called Ohrdruf. Private Don Timmer, 18 years old, was with the 89th Infantry. He had taken German in high school, which was how he ended up acting as an interpreter that morning. He later described what the unit found when they drove through the gate. Between the entrance and the barracks, there were roughly 30 bodies on the ground. The blood, he said, was still wet. The SS guards had fled only hours before. In their haste, or perhaps not in their haste at all, but quite deliberately, they had shot the prisoners they left behind. David Cohen, a soldier with the 4th Armored Division, walked into a shed near the center of the compound. He would spend the rest of his life trying to find the right words for what he saw. He never quite managed it. "We walked into a shed," he said, "and the bodies were piled up like wood." He said the smell hit him before his eyes could fully process the image. It was overpowering. It was unforgettable. There are no words to describe it. There were not just dozens of bodies. There were hundreds. Some had been sprinkled with lime, not to destroy them, but simply to reduce the smell enough for the guards to continue living and working nearby. Others had been partially burned on crude pyres made of railroad ties, but the SS had not had enough time to finish the job, and the charred remains lay where the fire had gone out. In the surrounding area, soldiers found mass graves that had been partially exhumed, the decomposing bodies of prisoners dragged out and thrown onto the pyres in a frantic, incomplete effort to erase the evidence before the Americans arrived. The prisoners who were still alive were skeletal. Their eyes were enormous in faces that had been reduced to skin stretched over bone. They had been starving, many of them, for months. Some were too weak to stand. The soldiers of the 4th Armored and the 89th Infantry, young men, most of them, who had fought their way across a continent and thought they had seen everything, stood in that compound and wept, some openly, without apology. This was Ohrdruf. It had been established in November 1944, a subcamp of the larger Buchenwald concentration camp system, located about 30 miles to the east. Its official code name was S3. Its purpose, as far as the SS bureaucracy was concerned, was to supply forced labor for a construction project, railway lines and underground tunnels near Mühlberg Castle, intended to serve as a communications center and emergency shelter for Hitler's headquarters if Berlin had to be evacuated. By the spring of 1945, the prisoner population had reached approximately 11,700 men, drawn from across occupied Europe: Russians, Poles, Hungarian Jews, Frenchmen, Belgians, Czechs, Italians, Greeks, Yugoslavians, Germans. The project they were building was never completed. The American advance was too fast. What was completed, systematically and thoroughly, was the killing. Prisoners who could not work were removed. Those too ill to be productive were moved to the dying barracks or transferred to the main camp at Buchenwald, or simply killed. The camp kept meticulous records, as German bureaucracy always did, and those records showed that from January 1945 alone, an estimated 3,000 men had died from starvation or been shot in the head. Torture was routine. The guards had a whipping table, a wooden structure designed specifically for that purpose, and it was used regularly and casually. Survivors described executions carried out for minor infractions, for the entertainment of guards, for no discernible reason at all. When the Americans began to close in during late March and early April 1945, the SS received orders to clear the camp. On April 1st, they began forcing nearly all of the remaining prisoners onto death marches toward Buchenwald, 30 miles away. Those who fell were shot where they stood. Those too ill even to begin the march were assembled on the parade ground, told they would be fed, and then machine-gunned. An estimated 1,000 prisoners died on those marches and in those final killings. The SS then attempted to burn the bodies, reopened mass graves, forced the last surviving prisoners to drag the decomposing dead onto the railroad tie piers and set them alight. Then the guards ran. 3 days later, the Americans arrived. News of the discovery traveled quickly up the chain of command. What had been found at Ohrdruf was not a rumor, not propaganda, not something that could be attributed to the chaos of war. It was a systematic, bureaucratically organized murder apparatus, and its physical evidence was undeniable. When General Dwight D. Eisenhower, Supreme Commander of Allied forces in Europe, received word of what his soldiers had found, he made a decision that would have lasting historical consequences. He would go see it himself, and he would bring witnesses. On April 12, 1945, 8 days after the liberation, Eisenhower flew to Ohrdruf. With him were Generals Omar Bradley and George S. Patton. A group of senior officers, aides, and diplomatic personnel accompanied them. They were guided through the camp by a survivor, a prisoner who had lived through it and could speak to what they were seeing. The three generals had known each other for years. They had planned invasions together, argued about strategy, competed for resources and credit, and driven each other to near-breaking points. Bradley was methodical, steady, the careful planner. Patton was fire and movement, the aggressive edge of the sword. Eisenhower was the axis on which everything turned, the political general, the coalition builder, the man whose job was to keep them all pointed in the same direction. They had seen a great deal of death together, in one form or another, from a commander's distance and sometimes closer. None of it had prepared them for this. The camp was still filled with the bodies of prisoners who had been murdered in the final days before the SS fled. They lay where they had fallen or where they had been stacked. The smell of the place was something that everyone who experienced it remembered for the rest of their lives, a physical presence, not simply a sensory fact. Survivors demonstrated torture methods to the generals. They showed them the whipping table. They walked them through the shed. Robert Murphy, a senior diplomat and political advisor to Eisenhower, who accompanied the group, watched Patton during the tour. He wrote later that Patton went off to a corner thoroughly sick. The sights and the smell had struck him physically before they struck him emotionally. The National World War II Museum records it with clinical precision. Patton, a man privy to the violent scenes of war, refused to enter this shed as the sights and smells in the camp had previously caused him to vomit against the side of a building. This was not weakness. This was a man whose entire identity had been built around the management of violence, the professional understanding of what war did to human bodies, being confronted with something that transcended anything war had produced in his experience. The difference between a battlefield and what Patton saw at Ohrdruf was the difference between two men killing each other and one man slowly, systematically, bureaucratically starving another to death over months while keeping careful paperwork about it. Patton wrote in his diary later that he had seen one of the most appalling sights of his life. He recorded what was in the shed, roughly 40 completely naked bodies in the final stages of emaciation, sprinkled with lime. He wrote that inmates told him 3,000 men had been buried in a pit a mile from the camp since January alone, shot in the head or dead of starvation. He wrote it down because he had to write something, and because Patton always documented what he saw. But the words sit oddly on the page. They are Patton's words, but they don't sound like the man who had written about tank tactics and cavalry charges his entire career. Omar Bradley, by his own later account, was revolted. He had no professional detachment available for this. Eisenhower walked through every part of the camp. His face, according to multiple witnesses, went completely white. Where Patton withdrew and Bradley recoiled, Eisenhower forced himself to look at everything. Every shed, every pit, every body, every piece of physical evidence of what had been done here. He did it deliberately. He said very little. When he emerged, he understood something that would shape everything he did in the days and weeks that followed. The war had been fought, in the public mind, and to some extent in the minds of the men who fought it, as a military conflict, a struggle over territory and power and national survival. What Ohrdruf represented was something else entirely. It was the reason, the actual, physical, undeniable reason, that none of this could ever be allowed to happen again. And he understood, with the clarity that sometimes comes from having seen the unthinkable, that people would try to forget it, would try to say it was exaggerated, would try to say the photographs were staged, the stories invented, the horror inflated for political purposes. He was not going to let that happen, not if he could prevent it. Within hours of leaving Ohrdruf, Eisenhower was drafting a cable to General George C. Marshall, the Army Chief of Staff in Washington. He described what he had seen. He wrote that the evidence of starvation and cruelty was overpowering. He wrote that he had encountered it deliberately, in his own words, in order to be in position to give first-hand evidence of these things if ever in the future there develops a tendency to charge these allegations merely to propaganda. He saw it coming even then. In April of 1945, with the bodies still warm and the smell still in his uniform, he was already thinking about the deniers who would come later. He ordered every American military unit not actively engaged on the front lines to tour Ohrdruf. Thousands of soldiers, men who had been fighting for years, who had lost friends, who were exhausted and homesick and ready for it to end, were ordered to walk through those gates and see what they had been fighting against. Eisenhower framed it directly. "We are told," he said, "that the American soldier does not know what he is fighting for. Now at least he will know what he is fighting against." He also sent a second cable to Marshall on April 19th, requesting permission to bring members of Congress and prominent newspaper editors to the liberated camps. Marshall had the answer the same day. President Truman and Secretary of War Stimson approved the request. Within days, congressional delegations and journalists were touring Ohrdruf and Buchenwald. The footage they brought back appeared in newsreels in American movie theaters. Allied occupation authorities ordered all German prisoners of war held in the United States to view the images. In Germany itself, Eisenhower ordered local German civilians, the people who had lived near these camps, who had smelled the smoke and heard the screams and looked away, to come and bury the dead. Patton, characteristically, did not wait for orders. He had already commanded the mayor of Ohrdruf and his wife to tour the camp and see what their countrymen had done. The mayor and his wife returned home. The next morning, they were found dead, both hanged. They left a note. It said, "We didn't know, but we knew." 4 words that have echoed down through 8 decades and will echo for as long as anyone remembers this. The soldiers who liberated Ohrdruf carried it with them for the rest of their lives. Private Joseph Simboli of the 89th Infantry Division spent decades unable to speak about what he had seen. He kept his writings locked away, sharing them with no one, struggling alone with the images from that April morning. It was only after his wife died in 2019 that he finally allowed his family to read what he had written. He died in May 2021 at the age of 96. His last published words described the experience with the honesty of a man who had spent 76 years failing to find the right way to say it. Some moments, he wrote, are so vast in their horror that your mind simply cannot process them as they are happening. Lamar Norton, another liberator from the 4th Armored Division, could not speak about the war at all without his eyes filling with tears. For the rest of his life, he would duck and cover at the sound of a loud bang, thunder, a backfiring car, a balloon popped at a birthday party. His granddaughter grew up knowing not to ask. John Beckett, a soldier who toured Ohrdruf on April 17th, wrote in his diary that same night, in the grammar of an exhausted young man trying to make sense of something that had no sense in it. All such atrocities that were known to savages in Roman times, here it exists today in 1945. How is it possible? How can a man treat another as such? He didn't punctuate it as a question. He wrote it as a statement of incomprehension. He urged his sister to read his letter aloud at their church back home. He wanted people to know. He didn't want to carry it alone. None of them did. The war in Europe ended on May 8, 1945. Germany surrendered unconditionally. The camps were documented, photographed, filmed. The footage was shown at the Nuremberg trials as evidence. It still exists. It is still available. Every year, fewer people remain alive who were there, who walked through those gates, who smelled the air, who saw the bodies stacked like wood, who watched George Patton turn away from a shed full of the dead and be sick against a wall. Ohrdruf was not the largest of the camps. It was not Auschwitz or Treblinka or Bergen-Belsen. It was one subcamp out of hundreds, a relatively small node in a vast system of organized murder. The prisoner population at its peak was under 12,000. The death toll was a fraction of what the larger extermination camps produced. In the taxonomy of Nazi atrocity, it was, by some terrible measure, a minor site. And yet, Ohrdruf was the first. It was the place where the American army came face to face with the physical reality of the Holocaust for the first time. It was the place where Eisenhower understood what documentation meant and what forgetting cost. It was the place where some of the toughest soldiers in the world wept openly and without shame, because the only shameful response would have been not to weep. It was the place where George Patton, who had ridden horses into battle in 1918, who had been slapping soldiers in the face in Sicily in 1943, who had told his men to grease their tank treads with German intestines, stood in the April sunlight of a German spring and could not make himself go inside. The last lesson of Ohrdruf is not about what the Nazis did, though that is essential to understand. It is about what Eisenhower knew in the moment of seeing it, that human beings, given sufficient incentive and ideological cover, are capable of anything. That the machinery of modern civilization, the trains, the paperwork, the bureaucratic systems, the industrial capacity, can be turned toward any purpose, including the systematic extermination of entire categories of human beings. That the only defense against it is memory, documented, preserved, transmitted memory, the refusal to look away, the insistence that this happened, that it was real, that it must never be forgotten and never be allowed to become merely a matter of historical debate. Eisenhower knew that in April 1945. He was already fighting the denial that hadn't happened yet. We owe it to every soldier who walked through those gates, to every prisoner who died within those fences, and to every man who wept without apology in that compound, to make sure that he did not fight that battle for nothing. If this story moved you, if you believe that history like this deserves to be told with the seriousness and care it demands, subscribe to this channel and share this video with someone who needs to hear it. Hit the like button. Turn on notifications. These stories exist because people like you choose to remember them. We'll see you in the next one.